My name is Emily Carter, and I used to be invisible. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, where everyone seemed to know each other, but I always felt like a ghost drifting through my own life. I was the quiet girl in the back of the classroom, the one who never raised her hand, who barely spoke unless spoken to. I wasn't bullied, exactly, but I might as well have been a shadow. No one noticed me, and for a long time, I thought that was safer. I was 23, working as a receptionist at a mid-sized law firm in Columbus. It wasn't my dream job, not that I even knew what my dream was. Every day felt like a loop: wake up, go to work, shuffle through papers, avoid eye contact, go home, and repeat. I didn't hate my life, but I didn't love it either. It just was. Confidence had never been my strong suit. As a kid, I learned early on that it was better to stay quiet than to risk being wrong or looking foolish. My parents were loving but reserved, and praise was rare in our household. My older brother, Ryan, was the golden child, charming, athletic, successful. I was the opposite: average, awkward, forgettable. Social interactions were torture. Even in my early 20s, I dreaded speaking up in meetings, avoided social gatherings, and meticulously planned every word before sending a text. The thought of confrontation, or even simple assertiveness, made my stomach twist into knots. I let people talk over me. I nodded even when I disagreed. I let others take credit for my work because speaking up seemed terrifying. It wasn't just at work. It was everywhere. I was a pushover in friendships, always the one making sacrifices, letting others make the plans, choosing the restaurants, deciding the movie. I was afraid that if I ever disagreed, they'd leave. That's how little I thought of myself, like my presence was a privilege, something that could be revoked at any time. Dating? Forget it. I had exactly one serious relationship in college, with a guy who liked that I was easygoing, that I never argued, that I let him make every decision. He broke up with me because, in his words, I was too nice. Too agreeable. Too passive. I remember nodding as he said it, even though my heart was breaking. As if I was agreeing with my own dismissal. Looking back, I wasn't living. I was surviving. Floating through life, afraid to take up space, afraid to use my voice. But what finally made me realize I needed to change wasn't some dramatic, life-altering moment. It wasn't a grand betrayal or a public humiliation. It was something painfully ordinary, something that shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but it did. It was a Monday morning, and I was at work, answering calls, forwarding emails, doing the usual. My boss, Mr. Stevenson, called me into his office. I walked in, already dreading whatever it was. He didn't look up from his computer. "Emily, can you organize the firm's annual charity gala this year?" I blinked. "Me?" He sighed, clearly impatient. "Yes, you. Just handle the details, venue, catering, guest list, all that. You don't have to do it alone. Just coordinate with marketing and the partners." I hesitated. I had never done anything like this before. My mind raced with all the ways I could screw it up. He must have sensed my panic because he added, "You don't have to speak at the event. Just handle the logistics." I swallowed, nodded. "Okay." He waved me off. Good. I walked out of his office, my heart pounding. My hands were cold, my stomach twisted in anxiety. This was huge. I had never been in charge of anything before. And if I messed it up? I could already picture it, the disappointed faces, the silent judgment, the inevitable realization that I wasn't capable, that I wasn't enough. The rest of the day, I felt like I was floating through a fog. I barely heard my coworkers. My thoughts spiraled in circles. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. And then, the thought that changed everything: why am I like this? Why was I so afraid? Why did I assume I would fail before I even started? Why did I believe that I was destined to be small, to be unnoticed, to never do anything that mattered? I didn't have an answer. But for the first time, I wanted one. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about all the times I had let fear hold me back. All the moments I had swallowed my words, shrunk myself down, played it safe. And for what? To stay comfortable? To avoid risk? Because that comfort? It wasn't comfortable at all. It was suffocating. And so, sometime between 3 a.m. and dawn, I made a decision. I didn't want to be invisible anymore. The morning after my sleepless night, I sat at my desk with my usual coffee, but something felt different. The same beige walls, the same muted office chatter, the same routine, yet, for the first time, I felt an itch under my skin. A restlessness. A whisper in my mind that said, this isn't enough anymore. The charity gala planning was my first real challenge, and instead of letting fear paralyze me, I decided to use it as a test. Could I handle responsibility? Could I step out of the background and make something happen? I started small. I made a list of tasks, broke them down into tiny, manageable steps. I emailed vendors, researched venues, and reached out to the marketing team. Each email sent, each phone call made, it was terrifying at first. My voice wobbled, my palms got sweaty, but I pushed through. Then came the moment I had dreaded most, a meeting with the senior partners. My job was to present the initial plans and get their approval. A week before, I would have done anything to avoid it, maybe even pretended to be sick. But that voice inside me, the one that had woken up the night before, kept saying, try. Just try. I spent hours preparing, anticipating every possible question. When the day came, I walked into the conference room gripping my notes like a lifeline. The partners barely glanced up at me as I started speaking. My voice was too quiet, my hands shook, but I kept going. Then something strange happened. Halfway through, as I laid out the plans, I saw one of them, Mr. Wallace, the most intimidating of the group, actually nod. Another one asked a question, and I answered without stammering. When the meeting ended, I expected them to pick apart my ideas, but instead, Mr. Wallace said, "This is solid work, Emily. Keep going." That was it. A simple acknowledgement, but it felt like a mountain had moved inside me. That night, I didn't feel like a ghost. The gala was months away, and challenges kept coming. A vendor dropped out, the budget was tighter than expected, and the guest list became a nightmare. Each problem tested me, but I handled them. Slowly, something changed. My fear didn't disappear overnight, but it became something I could face rather than something that controlled me. Outside of work, I started making different choices too. I stopped saying, "I don't care," when friends asked where we should eat. I spoke up in conversations. When my brother, Ryan, made an offhand joke about me being too quiet, I looked him in the eye and said, "Maybe you just never listened." His stunned silence was more satisfying than I expected. The biggest test came when marketing asked if I would make a short speech at the gala. It wasn't mandatory, but since I had managed everything, they felt it would be fitting if I said a few words. The old me would have refused instantly. But the new me, the one still raw and uncertain, but no longer content with invisibility, said, "I'll think about it." And then, to my own shock, I said yes. The weeks leading up to the gala felt like an emotional roller coaster. One moment, I felt invincible, sending emails, solving problems, making decisions. The next, I was plagued by doubt. Who was I kidding? I wasn't a leader. I wasn't the kind of person who gave speeches. But I had already said yes. So, I prepared. I wrote out my speech a dozen times, tweaking words, making it perfect. I practiced in front of my mirror, then in front of my best friend, Lauren, who had been cheering me on through this whole journey. "You need to stop memorizing it," she told me after my third robotic run-through. You sound like a textbook. Just talk like you're telling a story. That terrified me more than anything. I wanted a script. A safety net. But deep down, I knew she was right. The night of the gala, I stood backstage, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The ballroom was packed, lawyers, executives, important clients. I clutched my note cards, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely read them. I could hear my inner voice whispering, "You don't belong here. They're going to see right through you." Then, out of nowhere, I thought about that meeting with the partners. The first time I spoke up. The moment Mr. Wallace nodded. I had done that. I had planned this entire event. The decorations, the catering, the guest list, all of it. I wasn't just some shy, invisible girl anymore. I had built this. And if I could do that, I could speak for 2 minutes. I took a deep breath, shoved my note cards into my pocket, and walked onto the stage. I don't remember every word I said. I remember starting slow, my voice shaky, my hands clasped in front of me. I remember making eye contact with a few people in the audience and seeing them actually listen. Then, something shifted. I stopped reciting. I started speaking. I told them about how planning this event had pushed me out of my comfort zone, how it had forced me to find confidence I didn't know I had. I admitted that I used to be afraid to speak, but that this experience had changed me. And when I finished, people clapped. Not just polite applause, real, genuine applause. As I stepped off the stage, my boss approached me. Mr. Stevenson, who had barely looked at me when he assigned me this project months ago, actually smiled. "Well done, Emily." That was the moment I knew, really knew, that I would never go back to being invisible. The morning after the gala, I woke up feeling different. For the first time in my life, I wasn't replaying my words in my head, picking apart everything I could have done better. Instead, I just felt proud. That moment on stage, the applause, the nod of approval from my boss, it wasn't just about the gala. It was about proving to myself that I could take up space. That I was capable of more than I had ever believed. But confidence isn't a switch you flip overnight. The next Monday at work, I caught myself hesitating before speaking up in a meeting. The old habits were still there, whispering, "Don't make a fuss. What if you sound stupid?" And then I thought, what if I don't? So, I spoke. Not perfectly, not without a few nervous pauses, but I spoke. And the more I did it, the easier it became. I started taking on more responsibilities at work, volunteering for projects I once would have avoided. And people noticed. My boss started looping me into important discussions. Coworkers asked for my input. A few months later, I was promoted to project coordinator. Me, promoted. If you had told me a year ago that I'd be leading meetings, making decisions, and being the one people turned to for guidance, I would have laughed. But here I was, no longer invisible. Outside of work, things changed too. For years, I let friendships be one-sided, afraid that if I set boundaries, people would leave. Now, I started saying what I really felt. I told a friend when something bothered me instead of brushing it off. I stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Some people adjusted. Others drifted away. It stung, but I realized something important. I'd rather have a few real connections than a dozen relationships where I wasn't really me. Even dating felt different. I used to shrink myself down, afraid of being too much or saying the wrong thing. Now, I ask myself, do I even like them? It turns out, when you stop molding yourself to fit someone else's expectations, you attract people who actually see you. But the biggest change wasn't external. It was the way I talked to myself. For years, my inner voice had been my worst critic, tearing me down before anyone else could. You're not good enough. You're going to fail. People will judge you. That voice had been with me for so long, I thought it was the truth. Now, I fought back. You've done hard things before. You deserve to be heard. You belong here. It didn't happen overnight, and some days, the doubt still crept in. But I refused to let it win. One day, about a year after the gala, my boss asked me to mentor a new hire. Me. The girl who used to avoid even answering the phone was now guiding someone else. As I sat across from her at lunch, I saw so much of my old self in her, the nervousness, the uncertainty, the way she kept her voice soft, afraid to take up too much space. And without thinking, I told her the words I wished someone had told me years ago. You don't have to be perfect. Just start. Speak up, even if your voice shakes. I promise, it gets easier. She looked at me like I had just given her a key to something she thought was locked forever. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just leading. I was lifting others. That was when I knew this wasn't just a temporary confidence boost, it was a transformation. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was leading. And if I could change, anyone could. So, to anyone reading this who feels stuck, who feels like they're destined to be small, let me tell you, you're not. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But take the first step. Speak up. Try, even when your hands shake. Keep pushing, even when the doubt creeps in. Because one day, you'll look back and realize, you're not the same person anymore. And you won't want to be. And here's the most surprising thing, when you start believing in yourself, other people do too. When you stop making yourself small, others notice. You don't have to wait for someone to give you permission to be great. Just start. Even if it's messy. Even if it's terrifying. Because confidence isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward despite the fear. So tell me, what's something you've done that your past self wouldn't believe? Have you ever had a moment where you realized you were capable of more? Let's talk.